Hey everyone, I'm Kurt from Microsoft, and today I'm going to be talking about sharing styles with declarative shadow DOM, otherwise known as CSS modules. So diving into the problem, so shadow DOM provides style isolation, so styles from outside the shadow DOM don't pierce through the shadow DOM roots, and vice versa, styles defined in the shadow DOM don't spill out into the main document. That's exactly how it's supposed to work, but in practice, there tends to be a common set of styles between elements on a page, and so developers either end up duplicating styles or using some other strategies here. And so the script-based shadow DOM, which I'll call imperative shadow DOM, has a dedicated solution to this, but declarative shadow DOM does not have a great option today. So today I'm going to talk about a potential solution to this and go into detail, quite a bit more detail on the problem, because this isn't like a standalone feature like a lot of these presentations. There's actually quite a bit of context. So first bit of context is imperative shadow DOM. This is an old API. It's been around since 2013. You attach shadow, it gives you that isolation from the rest of the documents. And so developers use this for all kinds of things. Like, the big thing about HTML is like everything gets dumped into one document. And shadow DOM gives you an option to kind of opt out of that and have your own kind of modular styles. And then as I mentioned, there's typically a common set of styles for a site. And so adopted style sheets was added to imperative shadow DOM back in 2019. And it's a pretty great API. You can see a couple things to note here. The first two lines are just regular shadow DOM stuff. But the third and fourth line, it creates what's called a constructible style sheets, and it adds some rules to it. And at that point, none of these rules are being applied to the page. These last two lines in the document.adopted style sheets opts the whole document in, and then the next line, the shadow also opts in this example. So pretty straightforward, but this is a way to share styles between your document and your shadow roots if you wanted to. The other thing to note is that the sheet here is actually an array bracket, so you can pass multiple style sheets there, which is pretty cool. And then this is declarative shadow DOM. This is relatively new. It came out in 2023. There's been some great BlinkOn talks on this if you haven't seen it, but this essentially gives you the first example I showed you with shadow DOM, but without using script. So everything under that template node with shadow root mode is going to be in what's called a declarative shadow DOM. And so developers are really excited about declarative shadow DOM. It has a bunch of benefits. I mean, the big one is it's performant. The parser is very quick at creating elements, but there's a bunch of other reasons why people like this. It's developer friendly. Like, developers like writing markup to represent the DOM. You can see even in things like React, like there's HTML in your JavaScript. And then it's also SEO friendly. This is another reason why a lot of developers have moved to SSR to kind of publish their React and other applications. And then it's a nice little bonus here is you can actually turn off JavaScript. There's some people who are brave enough to do so, and declarative shadow DOM will actually work. So a lot of cool things about this, but it's missing adopted style sheets. There is no adopted style sheets property for declarative shadow DOM. And you can use the script version, like there's nothing stopping you, but it somewhat defeats the purpose. You don't get that great perf because you now have to go to the script engine and apply the styles. If your timing is wrong, you get the dreaded flash of unstyled content. So that's also not a good thing. And then developer ergonomics, it is just a gap that you can do this in the script-based version, but there's no declarative counterpart. So there's this big GitHub thread with hundreds and hundreds of issues about this specific issue. It talks about a couple other issues too. Like, it's a massive thread. It's definitely worth reading if you're interested. But there's like a couple common themes in there, and one is I would love to use shadow DOM, but I can't because of styles. And here's just a couple quotes I found of developers just saying, "This is a problem in my day-to-day life. Like, I can't do what I want to do because of this." And so this is one where it's just, there's a very obvious high amount of demand there. There's a couple other things that happen in this thread. The people in this thread proposed a number of solutions to this. This wasn't there's one obvious thing to do here that it will solve everything. There were numerous very, very creative solutions. So I'm going to go into a couple of these in a minute. But in practice, we end up seeing a lot of duplicated styles when you're using shadow DOM. So if your designer says, hey, I want green buttons, you'll have it in outer style tag, and then every template is going to have to copy that style if they want to do it declaratively, which there's a good reason to do that, which I'll get into. But yeah, and they add another button, you're going to have to duplicate this style. And this isn't just like a hypothetical thing. Our favorite website, Garrett Code Review, actually has a bunch of duplicated styles. You can see a shadow root there, and if you search for this host paper material, it's there, at least on my page that I looked at, 66 times just duplicating the style. And this isn't the worst thing. A lot of sites have duplicated styles, and I know Chromium's optimized for this, so it's not the worst thing. But you're sending more bits over the network. It is more work for the renderer to have to deal with all these styles. And so specifically for this, when Declarative Shadow DOM was announced, there's a great announcement on web.dev that has some examples there, and it kind of acknowledges this limitation, and it gives a pretty good workaround, which is use link.rel, put all your shared styles in a CSS file, and use link.rel in each of your template elements, and that way you kind of get some of the benefits there. It's also optimized to not download every time and to use one instance in memory. So it's a pretty good workaround, but it's not perfect. So first, it must be an external file, which I put with an asterisk. I'll explain in a minute. But there's also, like, a lot of these folks want really, really high performance. They want to get their first contentful paint immediately because they know that that impacts their SEO. And so Google Lighthouse actually says, don't use link.rel for your critical styles. And so developers are like, what are we supposed to do here then? And then so there was an option to say, hey, you can use a data URI, and sure, that works, but it's not a great solution. Like, it's kind of terrible developer ergonomics to write styles in a data URI. You have to escape quotes, and it's typically one big monstrous string, so that's not a great option either. And it also might not be optimized. Like, I haven't checked in all the platforms, but like having big data URIs and link.rel might not be using something like an atomic string to collapse into one instance. So it's good, but it's not great. And so the situation of this up to a few weeks ago was like, we had this big thread of developers saying, we want to solve this problem, and we had a bunch of proposals come out. Like, the thread has, I mean, at least 6 or 7 different well fleshed out proposals, and I'll go over quite a few of them in this talk. But none of them were really getting towards implementation in the platform. And so I was like, oh, here's a good opportunity to kind of solve this for a lot of people. So my goal was to kind of take all these and funnel them into one ideal solution from all of these. And so here's some AI art. It kind of got creative with the HTML tags, which is a little surprising there. Me and a few other members on our team kind of went through the whole GitHub thread. All I think it was almost 300 comments there. Teased out some requirements and came to declarative CSS modules as like a good solution for this. And so I made a similar presentation to this at TPAC, kind of making the case for that. It's a little different than this one in that I spent more time talking about the other proposals just because they are good proposals, and I wanted to get people to agree that, hey, maybe this is the right one. And so it went pretty well. Like, there were representatives from all the browsers, and no one objected and said, no, this is terrible, use this other thing instead, or anything like that. It was mostly focused on kind of details of what this declarative CSS modules proposal would look like. And so we have an explainer. There's an edge explainer. Our PM Tien and Allison and Dan Clark made a bunch of heroics to make that happen for TPAC. But it's basically opinionated that CSS modules are the right way to solve this. And it does cover, like I said, some of the other solutions and why they're maybe not the best idea for this. And then I've already started the tag early design review. I think the next meeting is tomorrow, so I would have done it tomorrow, but we'll catch the next one due to BlinkOn. And then I also opened a what working group issue for feedback. We got a couple of pieces already, so that's very, very exciting. It's like just in the very early stages, but there's a lot of momentum. So I mentioned I tried to find out what would an ideal solution look like. And so this is what I came up with. We wanted all markup based, so no script, because like I said, you can kind of do this today with script, and it's not ideal. We'd want it to support inline styles. This is where the link.rel solution kind of falls short. It would have to make sense with the existing adopted style sheets, because that's an API that shipped in 2019. So we didn't want to invent something totally new and leave that gap there. And then this was another interesting one. If you remember the first example I showed with adopted style sheets, you can create this style sheet, but not apply it anywhere. And this is actually a very interesting problem. There's not really a good way to do this in markup today. When you have a style tag, if it's creating styles, it's going to apply them to the main documents. And then also, I mean, this is a pretty easy problem, but it should support applying multiple style sheets like the script version can. And then, kind of looking forward, it would be great if this could be extensible to other resources. Like, style sheets aren't the only thing that people are going to want to share with Shadow DOMs. There was a lot of interest in SVG and other types of elements that you might want to kind of pierce that shadow barrier. So in the thread, there's a lot of talk about fully open styles in Shadow DOM, which you could essentially say let all the styles from the parent bleed through. In that case, it's arguably not so much Shadow DOM, but there are a lot of people that want this. My argument is this isn't quite the same problem that it's solving. So this is kind of a tangent to the specific adopted style sheets gap. But yeah, there's a lot of things to work out with this. Like, I'm not sure if this makes as much sense to standardize, just due to all the issues. Like, it wouldn't solve the adopted style sheets. It, is only really half of a shadow DOM if we were to do this. But I mean, it might be useful in the future. It's hard to say. So why is it difficult to translate the existing API to markup? I have these like 3 problems, which maybe challenge is the right word here, but it's, the script version, you're just using object assignments. And so for markup, typically we'd use something like ID refs, but since Shadow DOM scopes those ID refs, there was a lot of demand to have, some kind of global registry. And then there's also the issue that I call the style scoping problem, which is what I mentioned. Like, there's no good way in markup today to define a bunch of styles in a style sheet and not apply them to the main documents. And then the third one is the constructible style sheet requirements. So the current adopted style sheets API says you must use an adopted or a constructible style sheet. And so you can't point it to a style sheet from like a link rel or a style tag. And if this was still a requirements, this would be kind of a barrier. But fortunately, just I think in June, the CSS working group lifted this and said, hey, we can start speccing this, and implementers can do this for non-constructible style sheets. So fortunately, that one's already done by the working group. But as far as I know, I don't think anyone has implemented this yet, but at least it's one less challenge there. So here's one of the proposals that people came up with. I thought this one was really clever and really clean. So it's there's this feature called CSS layers, and you can add an identifier there, and you can imagine, an ID ref in adopt styles. It's not a whole style sheet. But this was one, the person who proposed this did like a polyfill. He did a bunch of test cases. He did a whole syntax for this adopt styles that you can like inherit and override. It's really, really cool. I actually prototyped this in Chromium because it was like a fun idea. But it doesn't solve all the problems. It's not the ideal solution because these layers get applied to the main document by default. So that alone is enough where this one doesn't fully solve the problem, but it's pretty close. I do think this could be, if there's still a desire after this that they want more granular style control, I think this is a pretty good one that you can have these blocks of CSS and inherit them. And then here's another proposal, the like @sheet syntax for CSS. This is a relatively, I wouldn't say new. I don't know how long it's been in specs, but it hasn't gone through the specification process, and no browsers have implemented it. But you can see here, this is pretty clean and makes a lot of sense. You give an identifier to your sheets, plug that into some adopted style sheets attribute, and that would be a pretty clean solution. But again, the ID refs are scoped here, so you couldn't have, if these were defined in a nested shadow DOM, the outer document couldn't access these. You'd have to do it top down. And for a lot of developers, that's kind of a deal breaker. They said, they want to have some component that defines some styles, potentially deeply nested in a shadow root, and be able to access that elsewhere. So, these are getting close, but not quite an ideal solution. And yeah, no engine support @sheet. So this one is also one that, potentially won't be a good option for some time. And then since the adopted or the constructible style sheet property was lifted, like, what if we did this? What if we just, plugged in an ID ref from a style tag or a link rel tag? This is also a pretty clever solution, would probably be very easy to implement. But again, it doesn't solve all these requirements for developers. This style tag and this link rel are going to apply to the whole documents. And then again, the scoping issue with Shadow DOM, if these are inside of a Shadow DOM, again, they can't be accessed elsewhere. And so, yeah, this one does not quite align with, the ideal solution. So I mentioned there's a lot of context for this one. So here's even more context. In 2021, CSS module scripts were added to adopted style sheets. And so what this does is this import sheet statement uses module syntax to, it'll download the file and create a constructible style sheet out of it. And then you can plug that right into the adopted style sheets for the script version. And the interesting thing with this is the module map is global. So this kind of, breaks out of that Shadow DOM bubble where everything can now access this, this sheet, as I called it here. So this is actually pretty promising and interesting. So if we were to translate this to markup, what would that look like? And so we have a proposal here. I'll give you a minute to take a look at it. It's got a few somewhat radical things about it. I'd say the first one is like we have styles in the script tag. And so this was done to match the HTML modules. Those are all done in script tags. That one at TPAC, like a lot of folks were not super thrilled with that because it is a little weird. So out of TPAC, a lot of folks said, what if we used the style tag here and gave it a different type? And that actually will work because if you give a type CSS module or a type foo in a style tag, it will just not treat it like a style tag. So we can give that a special case to parse it but not apply it. And so that should work pretty cleanly there. The other thing that's very kind of radical about this is the file syntax. So there is no foo CSS. It's basically an identifier here, but instead of using ID, we use specifier. And so this is kind of module terms that implies that it's global. And so the nice thing about this is that this does solve that global issue where you can have some markup, give it an identifier, and you can access it globally, even if it was defined within a shadow root. And so this kind of checked all the boxes of what the developers were looking for. You can also imagine, applying multiple here. That's a very easy, out of the problems I listed, this is a very easy one of just, a comma or space separated list. So that would be, very simple to do. And then you can imagine that first example I showed where like we created a style sheet but didn't apply it. We opt in the body via adopted style sheets maybe, and then we can opt in the declarative shadow DOMs and make this work exactly like the script version, but with no script. And so yeah, this does check all those boxes. There's no none of these are left hanging, and then there's the bonus that the module map is global. So this was kind of very enthusiastically supported at TPAC, and so that's kind of where we landed. And so yeah, I scheduled this talk, and then later Apple scheduled another talk specifically on CSS modules. So they're also very interested in this. And interestingly, so I reached out to them and said, hey, why don't I focus, on all these other solutions and kind of explain why this one's the best, and then we can use your session to kind of, talk about some of the specifics for CSS modules, and that worked great. We kind of collaborated on that. I, had my slides open during his session so we could kind of break it all down, and yeah, we got a lot of ideas there. It was very, very encouraging. And yeah, the audience members were very much in support of this type of approach. And yeah, we had all the major browser vendors were there and some invited experts, some framework authors were all saying, yes, this will solve all my problems. And so there were a couple kind of specific bits there that were debated, like the most contentious was like the script versus style. Someone also suggested template, which might be a decent idea. Very curious where this is going to land. This is still like very, very early in incubation. So, but so far style is winning, I would say by far. The global scope of the modules was like the kind of killer feature for this. And then there was also like some interesting things about this file-like syntax. They're like, it's a little confusing at first. So people said, hey, should this download a file if it's not already defined? Like what happens there? Like maybe you don't want it to download a file. You could put some kind of prefix. I don't quite know what the right answer is there. The script-based one will download a file, so maybe that makes sense. It's hard to say. But the next steps, we have a public explainer on MS Edge explainers. The draft spec obviously has to be written up, and then I started the standards process. So the tag early design review has been requested. What working group has been filed? I requested official positions from WebKit and Mozilla, but so far it's been fairly quiet. The what working group issue has had some activity, but then the next step is to prototype this one in Chromium, which I'm very excited to start doing. And so yeah, like I said, this is very in the early stages, so it would be interesting to get feedback from all of you. I think it's pretty exciting to be a part of something so new that has so much demand from developers. And then the other thing is that Apple is like very engaged in this too, so it's another kind of opportunity to collaborate with some of the other folks. So yeah, if you have any feedback, we can discuss here. You can also raise them in the public issues or email. And I'm also reachable on Chromium Slack if anyone else is interested for that. And yeah, I wanted to give some thanks. Mason at Google kind of kicked off a lot of this. And then Ryosuke at Apple has been great to work with on this. And then Allison, Dan, and Tian at Microsoft really helped us kind of get the explainer there and kind of, brainstorm ideas and make this kind of happen. So yeah, thank you. And any questions?
Very cool. So you were showing the file format. Is that like, I'm guessing that's parsed as a URL, like URL parsing with relative of the document? Like how does that work?
It's technically module syntax, so it's not quite a URL,
Okay.
but it's URL-ish. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think we'd want to support all the, like a scheme or things like that. It doesn't quite make sense. But this is something that, yeah, is definitely something that needs to be thought out. And yeah, it was, the module syntax is slightly different than URL, but it's URL-ish. And so like the script one will download, but I'm not as familiar with like what kind of restrictions are on that. You know, like, so that's something I need to learn. That's a good question though.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
So my first impression of this syntax is it's weird but creative. So it feels like we probably need a declarative version of create object URL. That's my my gut feeling if we want to make it less weird. And my but that's not really a question. So my question is this still going to work if JavaScript is disabled?
Yeah, that's one of the goals here is like this should be able, you know, since it's all in markup, it should work there and create like a, you know, a markup based module map.
Yeah, so we need to make, so can we still create a module if JavaScript is disabled?
I believe not today. So there's also HTML modules, and those, if you're using the script-based one, that's a good question. I actually don't know off the top of my head. That is a good question. I think that it should since it's not running the script, but I don't know. This one obviously could because it's not executing code. So even if the script one, you know, if the HTML modules via script don't, we could give an exception for this one. But I guess it is also kind of weird to break that link with HTML modules. So good question.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I recall some work being done on module maps, letting you map URLs to more user-friendly names. I wonder if we would like to hook into that functionality rather than directly the module URLs, just to be a little bit easier to talk about. Like those effectively are a magical map from not a URL to a friendly identifier, but from this inline style sheet to a friendly identifier.
That is a good idea. That's something worth looking into.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, as for the quick note for the naming option that's the specifier thing, there has been the same discussion appears in multiple things and repeatedly discuss basically the same thing. So anyway, I'm going to create a decentralized discussion for them. But also for short things, the currently the module map is the module map is the key the URL key based. So anyway I expect the key for these kind of inline script would be the URLs in informal way. But anyway, we can create something the fancy looking the URL like the special the URL scheme the dedicated for that purpose, or some other syntax sugar like things to make that the URL the actual URL things to look the more fancy. But anyway we can have some choices here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like the fact that it's URL is like it brings a lot of interesting questions, right? So that was also addressed at TPAC. Like, should we put some kind of prefix so it's clearly not a URL? Was one of the suggestions there, which might be worth doing.
All right, looks like we're good, Kurt.
Awesome, thank you.